important stage. With me this morning to discuss about the issues of the day. We'll cross back to Beijing shortly and speak to Sky's Katie Stallard in Beijing. But in the meantime, let's talk to our panel this morning. Labor frontbencher Nick Champion and Liberal frontbencher Paul Fletcher. Gentlemen, good morning to you. Nick morning. Champion, a show of strength from China today. Another reminder, while its economic growth has declined, it is a ever-rising power. In that context, I guess we look to the free trade agreement, this big issue in terms of our political debate right now. I really can't see Labor blocking this under any circumstances, despite your concerns about the labour market testing. It'd be an enormous problem for your economic credibility if you did.
Well, we shouldn't, I think, mark things up or down on that basis. We should look carefully at the content of the deal. The origins of the problems that governments are having at the moment occur with them setting an artificial deadline to sign this deal, and of course that put them at a disadvantage at the negotiating table. And the outcome has been is that they've seriously downgraded the protection of Australian jobs, particularly in regard to labour mobility, and they've confused the issue of free trade and labour mobility. So Labor wants to protect Australian jobs. That's what we're set to do, and that's what we will do.
But I can't imagine you blocking it. The ALP conference committed to a review in a few years from now, but it's hard to see you actually stepping up and trying to revoke a free trade agreement with our largest trading partner.
Well, what we want the government to do is to protect Australian jobs, and you know, we had all this talk earlier in the year about Tony's tradies. Then what we find is that at the negotiating table for this free trade agreement, I beg your pardon?
It's at the behest of the unions you're doing this.
Well, no, it's at the behest of Australian workers, Australian tradesmen. We had all this talk from the government about Tony's tradies. We now find that at the bargaining table they've seriously undermined the skills and labour market testing that's required, normally required for 457 visas. And we've already seen a couple of different scandals this week regarding a different category of visa, but an issue of visas and people working and breaching their conditions. Very little response from this government, and so Australian workers can, I think, rightly question this government's integrity when it comes to the free trade agreement.
Okay, Paul Fletcher, your response to that, because Labor says it just wants some guarantee that the labour market testing would be mandatory. If you did that, it'd all be done. The certainty would be there.
Look, what Nick Champion is saying is complete nonsense. This is Bill Shorten dancing to the tune of the CFMEU. Let's be clear, the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement is great news for Australia, it's great news for economic growth, it's great news for jobs. Huge opportunities in agriculture, in services, very significant opportunities with this country that makes up 22% of the world population. That is why former Labor Prime Minister Bob Hawke, former Labor Premier Bob Carr, the current Labor Premiers of Victoria and South Australia, amongst others, are all strongly supporting this agreement being signed as soon as possible. Who's against it? The CFMEU. And so Bill Shorten is dancing to their tune by concocting concerns. What Labor needs to do, if it supports Australian jobs and growth, is clearly come out and say they are supporting the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement.
And I guess the question is, Nick Champion, what government in their right mind would not enforce this element of the free trade agreement, whether it be mandatory or not, to have labour market testing, and before they allow foreign workers in? I just can't imagine an Australian government that wouldn't undertake such a measure. And I guess someone else who is more favourable on this deal is Jay Weatherill than yourself, your fellow South Australian Labor figure. Has he got it wrong?
Well, no, nearly every Labor Premier has talked about the importance of protecting Australian workers. That's what Labor federally has done as well. We've talked about protecting Australian workers and making sure the detail is there to protect Australian workers. We know this government can't be trusted to respond adequately on issues where visa category, visa conditions are broken. We've seen that this week with a couple of different scandals, and absolutely no response. Absolutely no response from the government. And, you know, you hear Paul talking about premiers and all the rest of it. You hear him talking about services and agriculture, but you don't hear him talking about construction. You don't hear him talking about electricians. You don't hear him talking about carpenters and joiners, because what the government has done is sold them down the river.
We're taking an economy-wide view. We want to encourage growth and jobs and opportunity in every sector across the economy, unlike the leadership of the CFMEU, which has a narrow perspective. And sadly, Bill Shorten is dancing to the tune of the CFMEU rather than doing what a national political leader should do, which is be concerned about economic growth and opportunities for the totality of Australia.
Well, don't talk over me,
Let's hear
Paul.
Nick's response now.
What Labor is doing is protecting Australian workers, protecting Australian tradesmen. And you'll find out there that that's what the public expect us to do. They don't expect free trade deals to sell Australian workers out. That's not what they're about.
Okay, all right.
What they're about is encouraging trade and economic opportunities for Australians.
All right, well, let's hear Paul Fletcher finally on this before we move on. This is an issue, apparently, from what I understand, very much resonating in the seat of Canning. There are 10,000 fly-in, fly-out workers in Canning of a seat with about, a bit over, like most electorates, a bit over 100,000 constituents, 10,000 of them fly-in, fly-out workers. So it's obviously a potent issue in that part of the world, Paul.
Well, growth and opportunity is very important. Creating new jobs is very important. That's what a free trade agreement will do. That's why our outstanding candidate in Canning, Andrew Hastie, is campaigning strongly on the free trade agreement and on the Abbott government's plans for growth and opportunity for Australians. And can I say, having myself contested a by-election a few years ago, what you have to do is exactly what Andrew is doing, which is focus on the concerns of the people of the electorate that he seeks to represent, namely Canning, and he's doing an outstanding job of that.
Okay, the Prime Minister was on 2GB radio with Alan Jones this morning and discussing the prospect of an increase in the GST, the rate of the GST. He says that there isn't he concedes there is an efficiency argument along those lines to lift the rate of the GST if, however, there is a broader reduction in the rate of taxation overall.
Well, as the Prime Minister pointed out,
Sorry, let's play the... I was telling our director if we can play the grab of Tony Abbott, then we'll come back to Paul Fletcher. Thanks.
Fundamentally, Alan, the overall burden of tax must come down. Now, I agree with you that there is an efficiency argument for taxing earning less and taxing spending more.
Correct.
I accept that there is a strong argument.
Good on you.
But it's got to be in the context of overall lower taxes. And the problem with a lot of the people who are saying just whack up the GST is that they want the overall burden of tax to go up. They want government spending to
keep
go
spending
up.
as it is and just increase revenue. Well, that's a nonsense.
Exactly, and that's just wrong.
So it is a real possibility here, Paul Fletcher, an increase, according to the Prime Minister this morning, in line with the tax white paper, if there is a reduction in less efficient taxes. I guess the most notable one, and one that would have to be addressed if you did go to move the GST, would be the income tax rate, Paul.
Well, let's be clear on the point the Prime Minister was making. There is a tax white paper process underway so that we can have a thorough look at the tax policy issues, including the tax mix. The Prime Minister was there articulating one of the standard tax economists' arguments for a GST, which goes to the relative efficiency and the effect on incentive to work of a consumption tax as opposed to an income tax. That's one of the many considerations that will be worked through in the context of the tax white paper. So we're having a thorough, careful national discussion about this, as we should. Let's do that. Let's have the discussion before we then come to outcomes. We need to understand and work through systematically the issues.
Nick Champion, your thoughts on that and the Prime Minister's comments this morning?
Well, this is a government that desperately wants to increase the GST, desperately wants to make workers and pensioners and people on fixed incomes pay more so that the rich can pay less, but they're just too gutless to tell the Australian people. And so what we get is this sort of commentary, you know, about how great the GST is, but then absolutely no commitment to do it. And you know, all this sort of waffling about tax white papers and all the rest of it, because they're just too cowardly to tell the Australian people their true agenda, which is one of regressive taxation.
But in terms of the broader argument, isn't this something where Labor fell down with your look at tax? The Henry tax review was precluded from even looking at the GST. Isn't the electorate smarter than that? Can't they accept a discussion, a debate about changing the tax mix if it's going to improve the efficiency of it, and with you know, subsequent and commensurate compensation for those on lower incomes?
Well, I mean, what you're talking about is a great, gigantic tax churn, really, of, you know, taxing people and then compensating them to, you know, compensate them for the taxation arrangements, which was, you know, the government's objection, I think, to the carbon price. Now they want to lift the GST. They're just too cowardly to tell anybody. And so what we have is this sort of, you know, on again, off again approach to, you know, to the GST. And it's terrible for consumer confidence. Consumer confidence has collapsed 10% since this government came to office. They've got unemployment stuck at 6.3%. They've got 800,000 people unemployed and below trend growth, and they seem incapable of sending out a straight message to Australian people. So they've really got to tell us their plans. Either they're going to do the GST or they're not. You know, their confusion on this issue, I think, masks their true intentions, which is one of regressive taxation.
All right, Paul Fletcher, it's going to have to come a time when the government, you know, steps up here to the plate. If you want to change, there's got to be leadership to lead the people to understand exactly what it means, like John Key did in New Zealand. It seems it's a bit waffly at the moment. You're talking about white papers and so on, instead of actually getting on with it and articulating your point, if that's where you want to head.
Well, 2 points. First of all, clearly we have an economic plan designed to drive growth. We had measures like the $20,000 instant asset write-off in the budget. Of course, the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, another important element of our plan to drive economic growth and prosperity. In addition to that, we are going through this thorough review process in relation to the tax white paper so we can properly weigh up the approach to take and, of course, in due course, then come forward with specific measures based upon that careful work.
All right, let's take a break. Back in just a moment with Paul Fletcher and Nick Champion.
Can a business have a mind, a subconscious, a knack for predicting the future, reflexes faster than the speed of thought? Can a business have a spirit? Can a business have a soul? Can a business be alive?
At SCW Eurodrive, we're all about solutions. From geared motors to heavy industrial gears, simple frequency inverters through to sophisticated decentralised technology or servo controls. SCW can tailor a package to suit your requirements. German technology, Australian know-how, local assembly, sales and service. SCW has the drive to keep you up and running.
SCW Eurodrive. We all want different things in life. Like finally going on that trip you'll never forget. Or maybe you just want to take charge of your finances. Well, that's why Syria brought out a flexible personal loan at just 6.9% per annum for 3 years, with no monthly or annual fees. And you can track it all on Citi's mobile app. Go online to citibank.com.au/loans or call 1300 787 139 today.
Big news for punters who like to deposit in cash. Ladbrokes Cash In is now available at over 1,000 newsagents around Australia. And it's as easy as 1, 2, 3. 1. Press New Deposit. 2. Fill in the amount and press Create a Code. And 3. Show your code to the newsagent to scan. Find a Ladbrokes Cash In newsagent near you and deposit your way with Ladbrokes.
If your car got hit by hail, that could be 100% disastrous. Or if your home got storm damage, that could be 100% devastating. So it's reassuring to know QBE Insurance is 100% committed to helping you. Call 133 QBE today.
There is no magic, no tricks, no sleight of hand. Because what we make takes dedication, discipline, and a lot of hard work. But when you consider what it means to the world, maybe magic isn't such a bad word for it.
This is AM Agenda. Thanks for your company with me this morning. Paul Fletcher and Nick Champion. Gentlemen, I want to play you a bit of the Prime Minister this morning. He's confirmed that the government will make an announcement next week as to whether or not Australia will expand our involvement in airstrikes from Iraq into Syria in the fight against Daesh. Here's a bit of what he had to say to Alan Jones in relation to what he calls the death cult.
I mean, the latest atrocity apparently was 4 young men being strung up and burned alive. I mean, the Nazis did terrible evil, but they had sufficient sense of shame to try to hide it. These people boast about.
Let's go to Nick Champion first on this. It seems inevitable the government is going to expand the airstrikes into Syria. Will Labor back it?
Well, there are some critical questions about the legality of action in Syria. Syria is a very big problem for the world, and the stabilisation of that country is probably one of the more critical issues facing the international community. I think its collapse as a government and into civil war has been a very, I think, destabilising sort of factor in the Middle East today. It's caused massive refugee flows, and of course it's opened up a vacuum for not just Daesh but also Jala al-Nusra and other groups to sort of gain territory. So it is a critical question. I'm not sure if military action alone will solve that problem. I think we have to look a bit more broadly at how we might deal with that, the sort of issues of Syria. So we'll wait and see, I guess the critical details of what the government proposes, in particular around the legality of any such bombing in what is essentially the middle of a civil war in that country. So we have to be careful. I agree that Daesh is evil, but this is a very complex situation on the ground there, and I think we have to be very careful about protecting our personnel in that situation.
Okay, let's go to Paul Fletcher on this and the Prime Minister's comments this morning to Alan Jones. Paul, your thoughts on all of that?
Well, if you look at histories of World War II and the accounts of Allied soldiers as they liberated concentration camps and the sheer horror and incredulity, they simply could not believe what they were seeing, and the response in the US and Britain and around the world as this news became known was just shock and horror. In other words, it hadn't really been believed. There was obviously information coming out beforehand, but in a time before social media and so on, it generally had not been believed quite how horrific the things the Nazis were doing in the concentration camps were. So the Prime Minister makes a very powerful point, that one of the differences is that Daesh boasts about what they do, and of course that is in part designed to aid a campaign of terror. And it is a difficult additional factor in modern terrorism, which civilised democracies around the world, including Australia, responsible members of the world community, need to take account of as we work through how we deal with what Nick rightly describes as a very significant problem, the collapse of Syria. This is a country of over 20 million people, which has descended into the most awful civil war and chaos.
Yeah, just spilling over into that humanitarian tragedy as well in Europe, that we see those terrible pictures of young children and so on dying in the effort to make it to Europe, and then it's horrific. Let's look to the GDP issue just to finish off, if we can, gentlemen. It's a big issue, of course, in this country. The slowing growth. Paul Fletcher, the Treasurer, tries to shrug it off, but should we be so sanguine about it?
Well, I think what we do need to do is recognise, as the Treasurer has made the point, that our economy is in transition. We've had a remarkable resources investment boom. We're now going to a different phase where resources export volumes continue to be high, but the prices have dropped significantly. We also had a particular seasonal factor with the Port of Newcastle heavily affected in April, which was reflected in the numbers. That being said, 0.2% growth on top of a very strong 0.9% in March. We look to be navigating this transition with greater success than countries like Canada, Brazil, other heavily resource-based countries. And of course, we have a plan to deal with this transition. It's encouraging to see services exports up over 7%, and services is a big opportunity under the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, which again makes it so important that Labor comes out and clearly supports the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement rather than dancing to the tune of the CFMEU.
And it's not going to hurt the sectors like tourism, for example, which has been booming in the last little while. The growth in tourism comparable to that ahead of the 2000 Olympics. So the lower dollar helps important sectors like that, doesn't it, Nick Champion? I guess you'd think as well the tertiary education sector too.
Well, yes, the lower dollar is a big factor, and I think during Labor's time in government, having the dollar over, over $1 US was a very big factor in sort of curtailing some of our export potential in wine manufacturing and in car manufacturing. And the tragedy, I guess, for my electorate is we would have been at $1 at 70 cents US. We would have been exporting, Chevy SS's and Caprices to the US in form of police car sales if we had a car industry. But this government waved goodbye to $1 billion worth of investment in South Australia, and we're now seeing that reflected in some of the GDP numbers. We're now seeing that reflected in my own state's growth, which was down 0.2% because of the national drag on this government. They've crushed consumer confidence. They've got unemployment over 6%. They've got unemployment up over 800,000 people, the highest it's been in 13 years. So it's little wonder that the backbench wants to get rid of this Treasurer and try and put a new face on what is a pretty difficult set of numbers. Okay. It's a difficult time for Australia. We need a government with a plan and with some confidence to implement it.
Just make the point, over 160,000 jobs this year.
Paul Fletcher, thanks for your time this morning, and we'll see you soon. A quick break on AIM Agenda. Back in just a moment, we're going to cross live to Beijing for a preview on that military parade to take place in the Chinese capital.